Some cases follow you home, but this one followed me through time. I'm Officer Nicole Rivera, 7 years with Bakersfield PD, and I've worked more domestic violence calls than I care to count. You learn to compartmentalize in this job, document the injuries, take the statement, file the report, and hope the victim finds the strength to break the cycle. But what happens when the cycle becomes something else entirely? Something that defies every protocol we have for measuring time and healing. Oak Valley Trailer Park sits on the eastern edge of Bakersfield, where the city gives way to scrubland and the kind of heat that settles into your bones by May and doesn't leave until October. It's the kind of place where domestics are as regular as the mail, where we know the addresses by heart and the stories by rote. Trailer 47 was one of those addresses. Emma Carlson, 26, lived there with her boyfriend, Derek Matthews, in a double-wide that had seen better decades. The first call came in on a Tuesday night in March. Standard domestic disturbance, neighbors reporting screaming and the sound of things breaking. I'd been to 47 twice before, once for a noise complaint, once for a welfare check that went nowhere. Emma always answered the door with excuses about falling downstairs or walking into cabinet doors. The classic deflections we hear so often, they become background noise. But that Tuesday night was different. When Emma opened the door, I could see immediately that this wasn't about cabinet doors. Her left eye was swollen nearly shut, deep purple spreading across her cheekbone like spilled ink. Finger-shaped bruises wrapped around her throat in a pattern so distinct they looked like a necklace made of pain. Her right wrist showed clear grip marks, the kind that come from someone trying to drag you or hold you down. "I fell," she said automatically, but her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Ma'am, I need to document your injuries," I told her, pulling out my camera. "These look serious. Have you been to a hospital?" She shook her head, wincing at the movement. "It's not that bad, really." I've heard those words 1,000 times, but something in her tone made me look closer. Emma was staring at my camera with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not fear, exactly, but something deeper. Recognition, maybe. Like she'd seen this exact moment before. I took the photographs anyway. Protocol is protocol, even when your gut tells you something isn't adding up. The bruises were fresh, maybe hours old, based on the coloring. Dark purple with edges of red, the kind that would fade to yellow and green over the next week. I documented enough domestic violence cases to read injuries like a calendar. Back at the station, I filed my report and uploaded the photos to the case management system. Standard procedure. Emma had refused medical attention and wouldn't press charges, so there wasn't much else I could do. Just another file in an endless stack of files. Another woman caught in a cycle she couldn't or wouldn't break. 3 weeks later, I got another call from Oak Valley. Same address, same neighbors, reporting the same sounds of violence from Trailer 47. When Emma answered the door, I felt something cold settle in my stomach. The bruises were identical, not similar identical. The same purple spreading across her left cheekbone in exactly the same pattern. The same finger-shaped marks around her throat, the same grip bruises on her right wrist. Even the slight tear in her lower lip was in the precise spot I remembered from 3 weeks ago. "I fell," she said in that same hoarse whisper. I stared at her, trying to process what I was seeing. Bruises don't work like that. They fade, they change color, they heal. These looked exactly as fresh as they had 21 days ago, as if no time had passed between my visits. "Emma," I said carefully, "when did this happen?" "Tonight," she said, but she wouldn't meet my eyes. "Derek got angry about dinner." I photographed the injuries again, my hands trembling slightly as I worked. Through the camera lens, the bruises looked exactly the same as in my previous photos. Same angle, same lighting, same shadows. It was like looking at a duplicate image, except I was standing in the same doorway, taking the same pictures of the same wounds. Back at the station, I pulled up my previous report to compare the photos. What I found made me question my own sanity. The photographs were identical down to the pixel. Not similar identical. The same image file, uploaded to the system 3 weeks apart, but showing the exact same timestamp from tonight's visit. I checked the metadata. The camera had logged tonight's photos as original files. But when I examined them closely, they showed creation dates from 3 weeks ago. It was as if the camera remembered taking these pictures before I'd actually taken them. I called Sergeant Martinez over to look at my screen. Does anything seem off about these photos to you? He squinted at the monitor. Looks like a standard domestic case. Fresh bruises, maybe a few hours old. Why? These are from tonight, I said. But look at this. I pulled up the photos from 3 weeks ago. They were identical. Martinez frowned. Did you accidentally upload the old photos to the new case file? I showed him the metadata, the timestamps, the camera logs. Everything indicated these were new photos taken tonight, but they were pixel-perfect matches for images from 3 weeks ago. Martinez suggested I was probably just tired, that domestic cases start to blur together after a while. Maybe Emma had been injured again in the same way by the same person. It happens. But I knew what I'd seen. Those bruises hadn't healed at all. 2 weeks later, another call. Same address, same neighbors, same sounds of violence echoing across the trailer park. This time I brought my personal camera as backup, and I made sure to check the date and time before I left the station. Emma opened the door, wearing the same injuries, like a costume she couldn't take off. The purple bruise on her cheekbone, the finger marks around her throat, the grip bruises on her wrist, all identical to my previous visits. But this time, I noticed something else. Emma was wearing the same clothes, the same torn t-shirt, the same jeans with a small stain near the left knee. Even her hair was in the same messy ponytail, with the same strands falling across her face. When did this happen, Emma? I asked. Tonight, she said automatically. Derek got angry about dinner. The same words, the same inflection, the same hoarse whisper. I photographed everything with both cameras, then walked around the trailer looking for Derek. He was nowhere to be found. His truck wasn't in the driveway, and Emma said he'd left after hitting her. But when I checked with dispatch, there had been no reports of Derek's vehicle leaving the area. The trailer park only had one exit, and Unit 12 had been positioned there all night. Back at the station, I compared all 3 sets of photographs on my computer screen. Identical. Not just similar, they were the exact same image file, replicated across 3 separate incidents. The metadata showed they were taken on different dates with different cameras, but they were identical down to the compression artifacts. I started digging deeper. I pulled Derek Matthews' record and found something that made my blood run cold. Derek Matthews had died in a car accident 14 months ago. Single vehicle rollover on Highway 58, about 10 miles east of Oak Valley. He'd been dead for over a year before my first domestic violence call to Trailer 47. I drove back to Oak Valley that night, not on official business, but because I needed to see for myself what was happening at Trailer 47. The parking spot was empty. No truck, no lights in the windows, no signs of life. I knocked on the door anyway. Emma answered, wearing the same torn t-shirt, the same bruises, the same expression of weary recognition. I fell, she said in that hoarse whisper. Emma, I said carefully, Derek is dead. He died over a year ago. She stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something flicker in her eyes. Not surprise, but relief. Like someone had finally said the words she'd been waiting to hear. I know, she whispered, but he keeps coming back. Every few weeks he comes back angry about dinner, and I can't heal from what he does to me because it's still happening. It's always still happening. She lifted her hand to touch the bruises on her throat, and I watched her fingers pass through the marks like they were made of smoke. But my camera saw them as solid, real, documented evidence of violence that had happened once and was somehow still happening, trapped in a loop that repeated every few weeks like a recording that couldn't stop playing. I filed my report that night, but it disappeared from the system by morning. When I tried to discuss the case with Sergeant Martinez, he looked at me like I was talking about someone else's file. The photographs were gone from the database. Emma Carlson's name returned no results in our system. But I still have the images on my personal camera. 3 identical sets of bruises that document violence frozen in time, evidence of pain that can't heal because it's trapped in an endless repetition of the worst night of someone's life. I don't take domestic violence calls to Oak Valley anymore. I requested a transfer to day shift, different patrol routes, anywhere that doesn't take me past Trailer 47. But sometimes, when I'm filling out injury reports for other victims, I catch myself checking the timestamps twice, making sure the bruises I'm documenting are actually new. Because once you've seen time break down like that, once you've witnessed pain that refuses to heal because it's still actively happening somewhere outside normal time, you start to question whether healing is always possible, or if some wounds are destined to repeat forever, waiting for someone to finally see them clearly enough to break the cycle. I keep Emma's photos in a locked drawer at home. Evidence of something that happened and keeps happening. Documented proof that some violence echoes through time like sound bouncing off canyon walls, growing louder instead of fading away. I've been a detective for 15 years, but I can't remember when I started working the Henderson case. Detective Frank Morales, Burlington PD, Domestic Violence Unit. I've worked hundreds of cases in Vermont's small cities, where old money meets college towns and everyone knows everyone else's business. But Elm Street is different. The Victorian houses there have stood since the 1800s, their gingerbread trim and wraparound porches hiding generations of secrets behind lead glass windows. Domestic violence calls follow patterns. Documentation becomes routine. Photographs, statements, medical reports, restraining orders that get violated within weeks. It's methodical work that requires emotional distance, because getting too invested in cases that rarely resolve the way you hope will burn you out faster than anything else in this job. The Henderson house at 427 Elm Street should have been just another address in my case files. A 3-story Victorian painted sage green with white trim, built in 1892 according to city records. Susan Henderson, 34, lived there with her husband Michael, who worked construction when he wasn't drinking. But something about that house felt wrong from my first visit. Not wrong in an obvious way, just unsettled. Like walking into a room where someone had just been arguing, that tension that hangs in the air even after voices have stopped. The first call came in on a Thursday evening in late October. Neighbors reported sounds of breaking glass and a woman screaming. When I arrived, Susan answered the door with a fresh bruise on her jaw and glass scattered across the kitchen floor from what had once been a coffee mug. "I'm Detective Morales," I said, showing my badge. "We received a report about a disturbance." Susan was average height, with light brown hair that fell across her face when she looked down, which was most of the time during our conversation. She wore a long-sleeve shirt despite the warm October evening, and I could see finger-shaped bruises on her upper arm. "Everything's fine," she said automatically. "Michael just had a bad day at work." I'd heard those words before, but as Susan spoke, I noticed something odd about the hallway behind her. It seemed longer than it had when I'd first looked through the doorway, stretching back farther into the house than the building's exterior dimensions should have allowed. "Where is Michael now?" I asked. "He went out to cool off." I took her statement and photographed her injuries. The bruise on her jaw was fresh, maybe an hour old. As I worked, I kept glancing at the hallway, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with the house's blueprint. But every time I looked, it seemed different. Sometimes the hallway appeared shorter, sometimes longer. Sometimes there was a door on the left side, and sometimes the wall was unbroken. I chalked it up to fatigue and filed my report. Another case that would probably repeat itself within a month. 3 weeks later, I got another call from Elm Street. Same address, Same neighbors reporting the same sounds of violence. When Susan answered the door, she had different injuries, a split lip and bruises on her forearm, but she was wearing the same long-sleeved shirt from my previous visit. Michael had another bad day, she said, using almost the exact same words. This time, I asked to speak with her inside. Susan hesitated, then led me through the front door into that unsettling hallway. But the layout was different. The staircase that had been on the right during my previous visit was now on the left. The doorway that had led to the kitchen was in a different position, and there was an additional door that opened onto what Susan called the parlor. I'd been in enough old houses to know that renovations could change layouts, but this felt different. It wasn't just that rooms had been moved, it was like the house itself was shifting, rearranging its internal geography according to some logic I couldn't grasp. "How long have you lived here?" I asked Susan as she led me to the kitchen. "Always," she said. "This has always been my home." The kitchen was different too. Last time, the sink had been under the window facing the backyard. Now, it was on the opposite wall, and the window looked out onto a side yard I hadn't seen before. When I glanced back toward the hallway, I could swear it was longer than when we'd walked through it moments earlier. "Where does Michael go when he leaves?" I asked. Susan paused in the middle of dabbing at her split lip with a tissue. "He doesn't leave," she said quietly. "He tries to, but the house won't let him. It keeps him here, but it hides me from him, sometimes for weeks." I stared at her, trying to process what she'd said. "What do you mean, the house hides you?" "It makes new rooms," she said, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. "When he gets angry, it makes places for me to go where he can't find me. Upstairs bedrooms that weren't there before, closets that turn into hallways, sometimes whole floors that don't exist until I need them." I looked around the kitchen, noting details I could use to verify her story. But even as I watched, subtle changes seemed to be occurring. A cabinet door that had been painted white was now stained wood. The refrigerator had moved slightly to the right, creating space for a pantry that I was certain hadn't been there when we'd entered the room. Over the next 6 months, I responded to calls from the Henderson house every few weeks. Each time, the layout was different. Rooms appeared and disappeared. Hallways stretched longer or compressed shorter. Staircases led to floors that shouldn't have existed in a 3-story Victorian. I started bringing a camera to document not just Susan's injuries, but the house itself. The photographs never matched my memories. Images that should have shown the same hallway from the same angle revealed completely different spaces. A staircase that curved to the right in one photo curved to the left in another, taken from the same position just minutes later. I began to suspect that Susan was moving between different apartments, but the address was always the same, and the exterior of 427 Elm Street never changed. Same sage green paint, same white trim, same wraparound porch. It was only the interior that shifted, like something alive. The case files grew thicker, but I noticed something disturbing about the documentation. My handwriting in the reports looked identical across months of investigations, as if no time had passed between entries. The photographs of Susan's injuries showed the same healing patterns, even though weeks separated each incident. And when I looked in the mirror after visits to the Henderson house, I saw the same face I'd seen months earlier. No additional gray hairs, no new lines around my eyes. The breakthrough came during my 8th or 9th visit, when Susan led me upstairs to show me a bedroom where she said she'd been hiding for 3 days. The staircase had 22 steps, which I counted carefully, but when we reached the 2nd floor, I could see through a window that we were somehow on the 4th floor of a 3-story building. "How long have you been living like this?" I asked Susan. She sat on the edge of a bed in a room decorated with furniture from several different time periods: a Victorian dresser, a 1950s nightstand, a modern lamp that cast warm light across wallpaper that seemed to shift patterns when I wasn't looking directly at it. "I don't know anymore," she said. The house started changing after the first time Michael hit me. At first, it was just small things. A closet that was deeper than it should be. A hallway that gave me extra time to get away from him. But it's gotten stronger over the years. Now it makes whole floors, whole rooms that exist only when I need them. And Michael? I asked. He's still here somewhere, she said. The house keeps him, but it keeps us separated. He's looking for me, but he can't find the rooms where I hide. Sometimes I hear him walking around downstairs, shouting my name, but the house moves the staircases so he can't reach me. I walk to the window and look down at the neighborhood. The Henderson house cast a shadow that was the right size and shape for a 3-story Victorian, but I was standing in a room that was clearly 4 stories up. The shadow and the reality didn't match, as if the house existed in 2 different versions of space simultaneously. That night, I tried to verify the details of the case in our database. Michael Henderson had died in a workplace accident 2 years earlier, falling from scaffolding on a construction site. According to official records, Susan Henderson had moved out of the Elm Street house 6 months after his death. The property had been sold to a development company, but I had months of documentation proving that both Susan and Michael were still living there, trapped in a house that changed its interior geography to keep them simultaneously together and apart. My reports existed in the system, filed and official, but they documented interactions with people who were supposed to be dead or relocated. I drove back to Elm Street that night, not on official business, but because I needed to understand what was happening to me. The house looked normal from the outside, a well-maintained Victorian, with lights in the windows and Susan's car in the driveway. When I knocked on the door, she answered immediately, as if she'd been expecting me. "How long have I been working your case?" I asked. "Time doesn't work the same way here," she said. "The house protects me by keeping dangerous moments from ending. Your visits, Michael's anger, my fear, they all get preserved, repeated, held in place so they can't move forward into something worse." She led me inside, and I realized that the hallway stretched infinitely in both directions, lined with doors that opened onto different versions of the same rooms, different moments of the same violence, different attempts by the house to create safe spaces within an unsafe situation. "Are you real?" I asked. "I don't know anymore," Susan said. "Are you?" I never filed a final report on the Henderson case. In the official records, it remains open, with regular updates documenting incidents that may or may not be happening in a house that changes its layout to protect a victim from an abuser who may or may not be dead. The house still remembers every moment of violence it has witnessed, and it holds those moments in suspension, creating endless variations of safety and danger. I age normally in the outside world, but inside 427 Elm Street, time moves according to the rhythm of trauma, preserving the urgent need for protection in an eternal present tense that never resolves. Some cases follow you home. This one kept me from ever really leaving. Some conversations happen in a language you don't remember learning to understand. Deputy Sheriff Patricia Gomez, Ada County Sheriff's Office, 8 years on patrol in the sprawling communities around Boise. I've worked everything from traffic stops on Highway 21 to domestic violence calls in the mobile home parks that dot the Treasure Valley like scattered dice. You learn to read people in this job, their body language, their tone, the spaces between what they say and what they mean. But what do you do when someone speaks without making a sound, and somehow you understand every word? Riverside Mobile Home Community sits along the Boise River, where the city gives way to farmland and scrub brush. It's the kind of place where people end up when other options have run out. Seniors on fixed incomes, young families saving for something better, and folks who just want to be left alone. The trailers are well maintained for the most part, with small gardens and wind chimes that catch the desert breeze. But domestic violence doesn't discriminate by zip code or housing type. The call came in just after sunset on a Tuesday in September. Neighbors reported raised voices, and the sound of something heavy hitting a wall. Standard domestic disturbance. Unit 43 in Riverside Community. I'd been to the area before, but never that specific address. The dispatcher noted that the caller had specifically requested a female officer, which usually meant the victim was more likely to talk. I pulled into the gravel driveway beside a white, single-wide trailer with blue trim around the windows and a small wooden deck that had seen better years. The porch light was on, casting a yellow circle that drew moths from the gathering darkness. No sounds of argument or disturbance. Sometimes that meant things had escalated beyond shouting. Sometimes it meant the situation had de-escalated on its own. Only way to know was to knock. The woman who answered the door was probably in her 30s, with shoulder-length auburn hair and the kind of pale complexion that showed bruises easily. She was wearing a long-sleeved flannel shirt despite the warm September evening, and I could see the edge of what looked like finger marks on her wrist when she reached for the door handle. "Ma'am, I'm Deputy Gomez with the Ada County Sheriff's Office," I said, showing my badge. "We received a report about a disturbance at this address." The woman opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it and shook her head. She held up one finger in a wait gesture, then disappeared into the trailer for a moment. When she returned, she had a small notebook and a pen. She wrote quickly, then turned the notebook toward me. "My name is Claire Brennan. Please come in. I called, but I can't speak out loud. My vocal cords were damaged." I followed her into the trailer, noting the layout and looking for signs of the disturbance that had been reported. The living room was small but tidy, with a couch facing a television and family photos on the walls. I didn't see any obvious signs of violence, no broken furniture, no holes in the walls, no scattered belongings. "Can you tell me what happened tonight?" I asked. Claire sat on the edge of the couch and wrote in her notebook for several moments before turning it toward me. Her handwriting was neat, precise. "My boyfriend Gary came home drunk and angry. He grabbed me and shook me, said I'd been talking to other men. When I tried to explain, he squeezed my throat until I couldn't breathe. That's when the neighbors must have heard us." I photographed the note as evidence, then looked more closely at Claire's neck. There were faint red marks that could have been from strangulation, though they were already fading. Strangulation was a serious escalation in domestic violence cases, often a precursor to homicide. "Where is Gary now?" I asked. Claire wrote, "He left about 20 minutes ago, drove off in his truck. He said he was going to Murphy's Bar on State Street." I called in Gary's information to dispatch and requested a welfare check at Murphy's Bar. Then, I sat across from Claire to take her detailed statement. This was where the conversation got strange, though I didn't realize it until later when I reviewed my body cam footage. Claire continued writing in her notebook, page after page of detailed information about the assault. But as she wrote, I found myself understanding more than what appeared on the paper. It was as if she was speaking directly into my mind, providing context and emotion that her written words couldn't capture. She told me, though, I couldn't hear her voice about the pattern of escalation in Gary's behavior, how the drinking had gotten worse over the past year, how the verbal abuse had turned physical, starting with pushing and slapping that had progressed to choking. She described the terror of feeling her airway close, the darkness creeping in at the edges of her vision, the certainty that this time he might not stop. But mixed in with her account of tonight's assault were other details, things that made no sense in the context of her case, but felt somehow familiar. She spoke about a little girl who hid in closets when the yelling started downstairs, about the sound of breaking bottles, and a man's voice calling someone worthless, stupid, a burden he never wanted. About the way fear could live in your body long after the danger had passed, making you flinch at sudden movements even decades later. I understand, I told Claire, and I meant it in a way that surprised me. You're safe now. We're going to find Gary and make sure he can't hurt you again. Claire looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Relief, maybe, but also something deeper: recognition, as if she knew something about me that I hadn't told her. I spent another hour with Claire, documenting her injuries and helping her understand her options for protective orders and victim services. Throughout our conversation, she continued writing in her notebook while I continued understanding far more than what appeared on the pages. It felt natural at the time, like any other interview with a domestic violence victim. It wasn't until I was driving back to the station that I realized something was wrong. I couldn't remember hearing Claire's voice at all. Not once during our entire conversation had I heard her speak out loud. Yet I had a clear memory of everything she'd told me, far more detailed than what she'd written in her notebook. It was as if we'd been having two conversations simultaneously, one written, one spoken, and somehow my brain had processed both. Back at the station, I uploaded my body cam footage to review while writing my report. What I saw made me question my own sanity. The footage showed me sitting across from Claire, asking questions and responding to information she was providing. But Claire never spoke. Her mouth moved constantly throughout the interview, forming words and sentences with normal cadence and expression, but no sound came from her lips. It was like watching a movie with the audio track removed, but only for one person. Even more disturbing was what I could hear on the recording: my own voice, responding to information that wasn't in Claire's written notes. I heard myself saying things like, "That must have been terrifying," and "How old were you when it started?" Questions that made no sense in the context of tonight's domestic violence call, but perfect sense if we'd been discussing childhood trauma. I replayed the footage 3 times, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with what I remembered. Each viewing revealed new details. Claire's mouth movements were too complex and sustained to be random. She was definitely speaking, forming words and sentences with the natural rhythm of conversation. But the microphone on my body cam recorded only silence from her direction. Then I looked more closely at the notebook pages I'd photographed as evidence. The handwriting was different from what I remembered. Where I recalled detailed accounts of Gary's assault, the actual notes were much simpler. Basic information about the incident, times, brief descriptions. But interspersed with these facts were other statements that made my blood run cold. Patricia was 7 when her stepfather started hitting her mother. She learned to hide in the basement until the shouting stopped. She never told anyone about the night he came to her room. That's why she became a cop, to save people she couldn't save then. Details about my childhood that I'd never told anyone. Memories I'd buried so deep I sometimes convinced myself they belonged to someone else. Information that appeared in Claire's handwriting, but described my life, my trauma, my reasons for choosing law enforcement as a career. I stared at the photographs of those notebook pages for a long time, trying to understand how Claire could have known these things about me. We'd never met before tonight. I'd never mentioned my personal history during our conversation. Yet somehow, in the space between her silent words and my inexplicable understanding, she'd accessed memories that I kept locked away even from myself. I tried calling the phone number Claire had provided, but it went straight to a disconnected voicemail. When I drove back to Riverside Mobile Home Community the next day, the trailer was empty. The landlord said Claire Brennan had never been a tenant there, and he'd never heard the name. The neighbors who'd called in the disturbance claimed they never made any such call. But I still have the body cam footage and the photographs of those notebook pages. Evidence of a conversation that happened in a language I don't understand, with a woman who somehow knew the parts of my story that I'd never learned how to tell out loud. Sometimes late at night, when I'm writing reports in the quiet station, I find myself listening for voices that make no sound, wondering if there are other conversations happening around me in frequencies I can't hear, carrying information that travels through channels deeper than speech. I never found Gary, because according to every database I checked, Gary never existed. But I still carry Claire's notebook pages in my case file, evidence of the night someone spoke my buried truth back to me in perfect silence. proving that some wounds make a sound only certain people can hear. The call logs show I spent 2 hours at an empty trailer, talking to myself. But I know better. Some emergencies are silent until someone finally learns how to listen. The best witnesses are often the ones you can't cross-examine. Detective Carlos Rivera, Wichita Police Department, Domestic Violence Unit, 12 years on the force. I've worked every kind of case that involves people hurting the ones they're supposed to love, from simple assault to homicide. You learn to appreciate good witnesses, neighbors who actually call when they hear trouble, people who step forward when others look away. But what happens when your most reliable witness has been dead for 15 years? Sunflower Heights is one of those middle-class subdivisions that sprouted in Wichita during the housing boom of the 1990s. Modest 2-story homes with small front yards and privacy fences. The kind of neighborhood where people know each other's business, but pretend they don't. It's the type of place where domestic violence often hides behind closed doors and carefully maintained facades. The calls started coming in about the Walker residence at 347 Meadowbrook Drive in early November. The reporting party was always the same, Margaret Stone, claiming to live next door at 345 Meadowbrook Drive. She called regularly, usually late at night, with detailed reports about arguments and physical altercations she could hear through the walls. Margaret Stone had a clear, steady voice with a slight Kansas accent. She spoke like someone who'd been reporting neighborhood problems for decades, with the kind of precise details that make a detective's job easier. Times, descriptions of sounds, observations about patterns of escalation. She was the kind of witness every cop hopes for in domestic violence cases, someone who pays attention and isn't afraid to get involved. The first call came in on a Tuesday night in November. Margaret reported hearing screaming and the sounds of furniture being thrown around at the Walker house. When I arrived at 347 Meadowbrook Drive, I found Jennifer Walker, 28, with a black eye and a split lip. Her husband Dale was nowhere to be found, but the living room showed clear signs of a struggle. "Did you hear the disturbance tonight?" I asked Jennifer as I documented her injuries. She nodded, then glanced toward the house next door. "Mrs. Stone probably called it in. She's always looking out for me. I don't know what I'd do without her." I made a note to thank Margaret Stone for her civic responsibility. Good neighbors can make the difference between a victim getting help and suffering in silence. After taking Jennifer's statement and photographs of her injuries, I walked next door to 345 Meadowbrook Drive to introduce myself to my helpful witness. The house at 345 was a mirror image of the Walker home, same floor plan, same pale yellow siding, same small front porch. But something felt off as I approached the front door. The windows were dark, and there was a stillness about the place that suggested vacancy rather than sleep. When I knocked, no one answered. I walked around the perimeter, checking for signs of occupancy. The yard was overgrown, mail was scattered on the porch from several days' worth of deliveries, and when I shined my flashlight through the windows, I could see that the house was completely empty. No furniture, no personal belongings, no indication that anyone lived there. But Jennifer Walker had clearly indicated that Mrs. Stone lived next door, and someone named Margaret Stone had definitely called in the domestic disturbance. I made a note to follow up during daylight hours and headed back to the station. 2 weeks later, another call from Margaret Stone. Same address, same detailed report of violence at the Walker residence. This time, she described hearing Dale Walker threatening to kill Jennifer, followed by sounds of choking and Jennifer pleading for her life. I responded immediately, finding Jennifer with finger-shaped bruises around her throat and terror in her eyes. "Thank God Mrs. Stone called," Jennifer whispered as I photographed the strangulation marks. "I don't think I would have survived much longer." After securing the scene and arranging for Jennifer's medical treatment, I drove to 345 Meadowbrook Drive again. Still empty, still dark, still that same unsettling stillness that felt more like abandonment than temporary absence. The next morning, I called the property management company listed on the for rent sign in the front yard. According to their records, 345 Meadowbrook Drive had been vacant for 8 months. The previous tenant had moved out the previous spring, and they'd been showing the property regularly but hadn't found a new renter. "Has anyone named Margaret Stone inquired about the property?" I asked. "No," the property manager said, "and we haven't had any unauthorized occupancy. We check on the property weekly." I pulled phone records for the domestic violence calls. They all showed the same number, registered to Margaret Stone at 345 Meadowbrook Drive. But when I called that number, I reached a disconnected line. The phone company had no record of service at that address for the past 10 months. Something was seriously wrong with my witness situation, but I couldn't argue with results. Margaret Stone's calls had led to 2 solid domestic violence arrests, and Jennifer Walker was alive because someone had been watching out for her. I decided to dig deeper into Margaret Stone's background. The record search is what made my skin crawl. Margaret Stone had indeed lived at 345 Meadowbrook Drive, but according to county records, she died 15 years ago. Natural causes, age 73, survived by no immediate family. More disturbing was what I found in the property records. The house at 345 Meadowbrook Drive had been demolished in 2009, a year after Margaret Stone's death. The lot had remained vacant ever since, never rebuilt. I sat in my car outside the Walker residence that afternoon, staring at the empty lot where 345 Meadowbrook Drive should have been. There was no house, just a patch of overgrown grass with a concrete foundation barely visible through the weeds. But I could clearly see a house there, pale yellow siding, small front porch, dark windows. The same house I'd approached twice to look for Margaret Stone. As I watched, a figure appeared in what should have been the front window of the non-existent house, an elderly woman with gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, wearing a blue cardigan. She was looking directly at me, and when our eyes met, she raised her hand in a small wave. Margaret Stone. It had to be. The woman who'd been calling in domestic violence, reports from a house that didn't exist, using a phone line that had been disconnected for months despite having died 15 years ago. I blinked and the figure was gone, but the sense of being watched remained. That night, I received another call from Margaret Stone. Same number, same voice, same precise details about Dale Walker assaulting his wife. But this time, I listened more carefully to the background sounds during the call. I could hear the faint echo that comes from speaking in an empty room. No furniture to muffle the sound, no carpets or curtains to absorb the voice. Margaret Stone was calling from an empty house that didn't exist. I responded to the Walker residence and found Jennifer unconscious on the kitchen floor with a head injury that would require emergency surgery. Dale was arrested that night for attempted homicide. Without Margaret Stone's call, Jennifer Walker would have died. Over the next month, I received 5 more calls from Margaret Stone. Each time, I could see her watching from the window of the house that wasn't there, reporting violence that was very real. I started taking photographs of the empty lot, trying to document what I was seeing versus what actually existed. The photographs showed only the vacant lot with its overgrown foundation. But when I looked with my naked eyes, I could clearly see the house, complete with the figure of Margaret Stone moving between windows as she monitored the situation next door. I finally understood what was happening during my last conversation with Jennifer Walker. She was in the hospital recovering from Dale's final assault, safe now with restraining orders and criminal charges that would keep him away permanently. "I want to thank Mrs. Stone for everything she's done," Jennifer said. "She saved my life so many times. Do you think she'd visit me here?" "Jennifer," I said carefully, "what do you know about Margaret Stone's history?" "She lived in that house for 40 years, Jennifer said. "Her husband died young, and she never had children. She told me she spent her whole life watching out for the women in this neighborhood, because no one had ever watched out for her. When did she tell you this? Jennifer looked confused. We talk all the time. Through the fence, on the porch. She brings me tea sometimes when Dale's at work. Jennifer, Margaret Stone died 15 years ago. The house next door was demolished years before you moved into the neighborhood. Jennifer stared at me for a long moment, then looked toward the window of her hospital room. Then, who have I been talking to all this time? I didn't have an answer for her. I still don't. I never received another call from Margaret Stone after Dale Walker was sentenced to 15 years for attempted murder. But sometimes, when I drive past the vacant lot at 345 Meadowbrook Drive, I can see her in the window of a house that exists only for those who need someone to watch over them. The case file officially lists Margaret Stone as an anonymous caller, but I keep her information in my contacts, just in case. Because in a job where victims often have no one looking out for them, sometimes the best witnesses are the ones who refuse to stop caring, even after death. Some people spend their whole lives protecting others. Margaret Stone has been protecting others longer than that. Some cameras capture more than the moment they capture what's coming next. Officer Janet Mitchell, Spokane Police Department, 6 years on patrol with a focus on domestic violence response. I've photographed hundreds of injuries in my career, from minor bruises to life-threatening trauma. Documentation is crucial in these cases. Clear, accurate photographs can make the difference between conviction and acquittal, between justice and impunity. But what happens when your camera starts showing you things that haven't happened yet? Pine Creek Apartments sits on the north side of Spokane, a complex of 2-story buildings that house mostly young families and senior citizens on fixed incomes. It's the kind of place where thin walls mean everyone knows everyone else's business, but people still mind their own affairs. Domestic violence calls are routine here, not because the residents are particularly violent, but because when someone screams for help, the neighbors actually call it in. I use an older digital camera for injury documentation, a reliable Canon that's been with me for 3 years. It takes sharp, clear photographs with accurate color reproduction, essential for medical evidence that might be scrutinized in court months later. The camera has never malfunctioned, never produced strange artifacts or distorted images, until I started photographing Laura Patterson's injuries. The first call to apartment 12 came in on a Wednesday evening in October. Neighbors reported sounds of a struggle and a woman crying for help. When I arrived, I found Laura Patterson, 31, with a bruised cheek and swollen lower lip. Her boyfriend, Kevin Walsh, was gone, but the apartment showed signs of a physical altercation, overturned furniture, broken dishes in the kitchen sink. Laura was cooperative but clearly shaken. She sat on her couch while I took her statement, unconsciously touching the bruise on her left cheek. The injury was fresh, maybe an hour old, with the deep red coloring that indicated recent trauma. Her lip was split in one small place, with a tiny amount of dried blood at the corner of her mouth. "He's never hit me before," Laura said, which is what they always say, even when the evidence suggests otherwise. "He was drinking, and he got angry when I asked him to turn down the television. He just snapped." I photographed her injuries according to standard protocol. Close-up shots of the facial bruising, the split lip, and some minor scratches on her forearms where Kevin had grabbed her. Through the camera's viewfinder, the injuries looked exactly as I expected, consistent with a single slap and some rough handling. Standard domestic violence documentation. But when I uploaded the photos back at the station, something was wrong. The images showed injuries that were far more severe than what I'd witnessed. Laura's cheek wasn't just bruised, it was swollen and discolored with the deep purple of significant trauma. Her lip wasn't just split, it was badly swollen with multiple lacerations. Most disturbing were injuries that I hadn't seen at all. A black eye that was completely absent when I'd examined her in person, and finger-shaped bruises around her throat that suggested strangulation. I stared at the photographs on my computer screen. trying to reconcile what I was seeing with what I remembered. The metadata confirmed these were the photos I'd taken that evening, with the correct timestamp and location data, but they showed injuries that simply hadn't existed when I'd examined Laura Patterson. I assumed there was something wrong with the camera or the upload process. Digital files could be corrupted, cameras could malfunction. I made a note to have the equipment checked and filed my report based on what I'd observed in person, not what appeared in the photographs. 3 weeks later, another call from apartment 12. Same neighbors, same sounds of violence, same request for police response. When Laura answered the door, I felt my blood turn cold. She had the exact injuries that had appeared in my previous photographs. The deep purple bruising on her cheek, the severely swollen lip, the black eye that had been impossible the first time I'd seen her. It happened again, she said through lips that were so swollen she could barely speak clearly. Kevin came back drunk and angry. He said I'd called the police on him for nothing, so this time he'd give me something worth calling about. I photographed her new injuries, fighting a growing sense of unease. Through the viewfinder, I could see the damage Kevin had inflicted. Facial trauma that matched exactly what had appeared in my impossible photographs 3 weeks earlier. But as I worked, I noticed that the camera seemed to be capturing additional details that I couldn't see with my naked eye. When I developed these new photos, they showed injuries even more severe than what Laura currently had. The black eye was deeper, the bruising more extensive. There were new elements, a split eyebrow that wasn't currently injured, a swollen jaw that showed no signs of trauma when I examined her in person, and what looked like bite marks on her shoulder that were covered by her clothing. I was looking at photographs of Laura Patterson's future injuries. The camera was somehow documenting violence that hadn't happened yet. Over the next 2 months, I responded to 4 more domestic violence calls at apartment 12. Each time, Laura's actual injuries matched exactly what had appeared in my previous photographs. And each time, my new photos showed escalating trauma that wouldn't manifest until Kevin's next assault. The pattern was horrifyingly predictable. The camera would capture injuries that were worse than reality, and reality would catch up within weeks. A bruised cheek would become a fractured cheek. A split lip would become a broken tooth. Minor injuries would escalate to major trauma, all documented in advance by a camera that seemed to see through time. I tried everything I could think of to break the cycle. I used different cameras, different settings, different lighting. But every time I photographed Laura Patterson's injuries, the images showed damage that exceeded what was actually present. The camera was creating a photographic timeline of escalating domestic violence, documenting each step of Kevin Walsh's progression toward potentially lethal assault. The breakthrough came when I realized what the camera was really showing me. It wasn't predicting random future injuries, it was documenting the logical progression of domestic violence escalation. Kevin Walsh was following a predictable pattern of increasing severity, and somehow, my camera was capturing the inevitable endpoint of that pattern. The final photographs I took of Laura Patterson showed injuries that made my hands shake as I held the camera. Severe facial trauma, defensive wounds on her hands and arms, and what appeared to be ligature marks around her neck. The timestamp on these photos was from a Tuesday evening in December, but they showed damage that would have required immediate hospitalization. I didn't wait for reality to catch up to the photographs this time. I arrested Kevin Walsh on outstanding warrants that Wednesday morning and held him without bail. I connected Laura with victim services and helped her relocate to a safe house outside Spokane County. I made sure she understood that the pattern of violence would continue to escalate, that the next assault might be the one that killed her. Laura Patterson survived because I learned to trust what my camera was telling me about the future. But the experience left me questioning everything I thought I knew about time, causality, and the nature of evidence. I still use the same camera for injury documentation, but I approach each domestic violence case with the understanding that some photographs capture more than the present moment. They capture the trajectory of violence, the inevitable progression from minor assault to major trauma to potential homicide. Sometimes, the camera shows me injuries that never manifest because we intervene before they can occur. Sometimes it shows me futures that get prevented by arrest, relocation, or the victim finding the strength to break the cycle. But sometimes it shows me photographs of violence that feels so inevitable, so locked into the pattern of escalation, that intervention seems almost impossible. I keep Laura Patterson's final photographs in a secure file, images of injuries that never happened because we changed the timeline. They serve as a reminder that domestic violence follows predictable patterns, that escalation is both inevitable and preventable, and that sometimes the most important evidence is the evidence of what could happen if we don't act. The camera still takes normal photographs most of the time, but occasionally, when I'm documenting domestic violence injuries, I see something in the viewfinder that exceeds the reality in front of me. When that happens, I know I'm not just taking pictures of what was, I'm documenting what will be, unless someone changes the story's ending. Some evidence documents the past. Some evidence warns about the future. Both kinds are equally real, and both require action. Sometimes, the most important witnesses are the ones who can't be seen. Detective Thomas Bradley, Albuquerque Police Department, Domestic Violence Unit, 9 years working cases where love turns violent and trust becomes weapon. Desert Wind Estates is the kind of subdivision where adobe-style homes bake under the New Mexico sun, where privacy walls hide family secrets and swimming pools reflect more than just sky. I've worked dozens of domestic violence cases in neighborhoods like this, places where silence is golden and neighbors mind their own business until someone screams loud enough to shatter the illusion of suburban peace. The call came in on a Thursday evening in late September, when the desert heat was finally breaking and the mountains around Albuquerque turned purple against the sunset. Grace Martinez had called to report ongoing domestic violence at her residence on Sandstone Drive. The dispatch notes indicated she'd been calling regularly for several months, always the same address, always the same complaint about her boyfriend's escalating abuse. I'd never worked a Grace Martinez case before, but domestic violence victims often take time to build trust with law enforcement. Multiple calls, multiple reports, a pattern of reaching out when the fear becomes overwhelming, then withdrawing when the immediate danger passes. It's a cycle I'd seen hundreds of times. The house at 412 Sandstone Drive was a single-story ranch with a red tile roof and desert landscaping that required minimal water. Grace Martinez answered the door before I'd finished walking up the flagstone path, as if she'd been watching for my arrival. She was probably in her early 30s, with long, dark hair and brown eyes that held the particular wariness I'd learned to recognize in domestic violence victims. "Thank you for coming," she said, stepping aside to let me enter. I wasn't sure anyone would believe me this time. The interior was tastefully decorated with Southwestern art and furniture that looked expensive but not ostentatious. Family photographs lined the mantelpiece above a gas fireplace, showing Grace with various relatives at celebrations and gatherings. Everything looked normal, peaceful even. No signs of the violent struggle that had prompted her call. "Where is your boyfriend now?" I asked, settling into a chair across from the couch where Grace had seated herself. "Daniel left about an hour ago," she said. "He got angry when I asked him to help with dinner preparations, started throwing things, grabbed me by the shoulders, and shook me. I think he would have hit me if the neighbors hadn't been outside working in their yard." I looked at Grace's shoulders and arms for signs of the assault she'd described. She was wearing a long-sleeve shirt despite the warm evening, but I could see no obvious bruising or marks on her hands, neck, or face. Sometimes injuries took time to develop, and victims often covered damage with clothing or makeup. "Has Daniel been physically violent before?" I asked. Grace nodded, wrapping her arms around herself. It started about 6 months ago. Little things at first, pushing, grabbing my wrist too hard during arguments. But it's been getting worse. Last week he threw a glass at me. It shattered against the wall right next to my head. I took notes as Grace described a classic pattern of domestic violence escalation. Her story was consistent, detailed, and emotionally authentic. She spoke with the kind of tired resignation that comes from living in constant fear, looking over her shoulder even in her own home. But something felt off about the interview, though I couldn't immediately identify what was bothering me. Grace seemed solid, present, engaged in our conversation. She answered my questions directly and provided specific details about dates, times, and incidents. Yet I found myself occasionally glancing around the room as if looking for something I couldn't quite name. "Would you be willing to press charges against Daniel?" I asked. "I want to," Grace said, "but I'm scared he'll retaliate. He's threatened to kill me if I ever involve the police. He says no one will believe me because I don't have any proof." I spent another hour with Grace, documenting her statement and explaining her options for restraining orders and victim services. Throughout our conversation, I noticed that I kept catching glimpses of her in the periphery of my vision reflections, in the glass-topped coffee table, in the black screen of the television, in the chrome fixtures of the kitchen visible through the archway. It wasn't unusual to notice reflections during interviews, but something about seeing Grace in these mirrored surfaces felt more vivid than looking at her directly. In the reflections, she seemed more present somehow, more three-dimensional than the woman sitting across from me on the couch. When I left the house that evening, I made a note to follow up with neighbors about any disturbances they might have witnessed. Corroborating testimony would strengthen Grace's case if she decided to move forward with charges against Daniel. 2 weeks later, Grace called again. Same complaint, same pattern of escalating violence from Daniel. This time she reported that he'd pushed her down a flight of stairs and she was concerned about potential internal injuries. I responded immediately, but when Grace answered the door, she showed no signs of having fallen downstairs. No bruises, no indication of pain when she moved, no visible injuries at all. "Are you sure you don't need medical attention?" I asked as we sat in her living room again. "The pain is mostly internal," Grace said. "I don't think anything is broken, but I'm worried about what might happen next time." As Grace spoke, I found myself focusing more and more on her reflections in the various surfaces around the room. In the glass of a framed photograph, I could see her gesturing as she described Daniel's assault. In the polished surface of an end table, her reflection showed the strain and fear that should have been visible on her face. But when I looked directly at Grace, these details seemed somehow muted, less distinct. I started documenting these interviews with more care, taking photographs of the scene and making detailed notes about Grace's demeanor and appearance. Something was happening that I didn't understand, but my job was to build a case that would protect Grace from further violence. The pattern continued for months. Regular calls from Grace Martinez, always the same address, always reports of escalating domestic violence from a boyfriend named Daniel who was never present when I arrived. Grace's injuries were always minimal or invisible, but her fear was clearly genuine. Each time, I noticed that her reflections seemed more real than her physical presence. The breakthrough came when I requested security camera footage from Grace's neighbors to corroborate her reports of Daniel's violent behavior. The homeowner across the street had a system that captured most of the activity on Sandstone Drive, including the front of Grace's house. What I saw in that footage made me question my own sanity. The videos showed me arriving at 412 Sandstone Drive, walking up to the front door, and apparently speaking to empty air. The door never opened. No one answered my knock. But the audio clearly captured my voice, asking questions, and a woman's voice responding, Grace's voice, coming from somewhere the cameras couldn't identify. In video after video, spanning months of visits, I could see myself conducting interviews with no one visible. I sat in Grace's living room talking to an empty couch, taking notes while a disembodied voice provided detailed accounts of domestic violence. The conversations I remembered having with Grace Martinez had apparently been happening entirely in my head, or with someone the cameras couldn't see. I drove back to 412 Sandstone Drive that night, not on official business but because I needed to understand what was happening to me. The house looked normal from the outside, but when I knocked on the door, no one answered. I used my flashlight to peer through the windows, and what I saw inside made my blood run cold. The house was empty. Not just vacant, it looked like it had been empty for years. Dust covered every surface, cobwebs hung in the corners, and the expensive furniture I remembered from my visits was nowhere to be seen. But in the reflection of my flashlight beam on the window glass, I could see Grace Martinez standing in the living room, looking directly at me with an expression of desperate hope. I spent that night researching the property records for 412 Sandstone Drive. What I found explained everything and nothing at the same time. Grace Martinez had indeed lived at that address, but according to police records, she'd been murdered 3 years ago by her boyfriend Daniel Santos, who'd beaten her to death during a domestic violence incident. The case had been solved, Santos convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Grace Martinez had been dead for 3 years. But somehow, she'd been trying to report her own murder to me for months, speaking from somewhere between life and death, visible only in reflections, desperate to tell someone what had happened to her, even though justice had already been served. I understood then why I could only see Grace clearly in mirrors and reflective surfaces. She existed now, in a world of echoes and shadows, in the space between what was and what could have been. She'd been trying to report the violence that had killed her, repeating her final attempts to seek help in an endless loop of testimony that no living person could fully witness. I never filed a final report on the Grace Martinez case. How do you document interviews with a murder victim who's been dead for 3 years? How do you explain months of conversations with someone who exists only in reflections? But I learned something important about domestic violence that night. Sometimes the most important testimony comes from victims who can no longer speak for themselves. Sometimes the evidence of what happened lives on in places we can't see directly, waiting for someone who knows how to look in the right shadows, the right mirrors, the right reflections of light and memory. I still carry my badge, and sometimes when the light hits it just right, I can see Grace Martinez in its polished surface, still trying to report what happened to her, still hoping someone will listen and understand that some stories don't end when the victim dies. They just move to a different frequency, waiting for someone who knows how to tune in to the right wavelength of justice. Some witnesses can't be cross-examined because they're no longer alive, but their testimony lives on in every reflection, every echo, every shadow that holds the memory of violence that should never be forgotten.